Chapter 1. The Weight of Sacrifice. Her world was a lie built on chamomile and silence. The steam from Seraphina's herbal tincture cabinet was the only thing warm in the small, stone shop. It smelled of mint and earth, the honest scent of the lower tiers, a scent High Elder Kaelen's aristocratic wolves pretended didn't exist. Yet, in this meticulously organized space, Seraphina felt safe. Safety was everything. Her fingers worked fast, labeling bottles of balm. Maybe it was fate, but the labels, usually smooth, kept catching, tearing at the edges. A nervous flutter, sharp as a sliver of glass, settled in her chest. "Sister, stop fussing." Seraphina glanced up. Her younger sister, Lyra, perched on a workbench, her eyes wide and bright. Lyra was the sun in Seraphina's shadowed life. She was, unbeknownst to her, the political pawn Kaelen had expertly moved into check. "I am not fussing, Lyra. I am being precise," Seraphina corrected, keeping her voice light. And all at once, everything changed. She saw the small, dried flower Lyra held a bloom from the king's forbidden royal gardens. "Did you go to the citadel again, Lyra?" Seraphina asked, her voice dropping to a low tone that held both fear and authority. Lyra's smile faltered. "Just outside. I only wanted to see the big statues. And this was on the path." "It means nothing." "It means everything," Seraphina whispered. "The decree is clear. Trespass on the outer grounds is minor treason, unless you are an Omega with no rank." The Werewolf society was rigidly structured, Alpha at the top, Beta middle class, Omega bottom. Treason charges against Omegas were usually dismissed or received small fines. But Kaelen had recently pushed through a new, vague law making any perceived disrespect to the crown, even a broken flower, punishable by public flogging for citizens of the lower tiers. It was his way to challenge King Elias's perceived leniency. "But you are just meant to heal things, Seraphina. You are not strong like the Alpha guards." Lyra slid off the bench, her beta energy restless. Seraphina walked to her, smoothing the lines from her own brow. She held her sister's hands. Lyra's hands were rough, honest, but impulsive. "My strength is not in my claws, Lyra. It is in my planning. You must promise me to stay away from the citadel until the spring festival." "Promise." Despite that quiet moment, the air in the shop felt thin, like a tight wire stretched to breaking. Seraphina had seen Kaelen's guards circling the lower tiers all week. They weren't looking for beta agitators, they were looking for an excuse. That night, after Lyra had finally fallen asleep in the small room off the back, Seraphina prepared. She pulled out a hidden piece of parchment, a summons delivered earlier that day. It demanded one of the Vane sisters appear for questioning regarding the defacement of royal property. The parchment listed the penalty, flogging, unless a suitable bond was paid, a sum Seraphina could never afford. She took a deep, steadying breath. "The only way to protect those I love is through self-sacrifice and accepting the pain others inflict." This belief felt like a truth she'd been born with. It was her initial goal, securing Lyra's freedom. As if fate demanded it, a sudden, icy wind slammed against the small shop window, rattling the glass. The sound was a loud, desperate warning. Seraphina quickly wrote a reply on the summons, signing her name, Seraphina Vane, Omega citizen. She folded it, placing it carefully in the hands of the royal messenger who waited outside. Not only that, she sealed the entire front of her shop with a simple, final prayer, knowing by the time the sun touched the citadel peaks, she would be gone from her safe world forever. The smell of mint and earth was swallowed by the cold fear that now clung to her skin. As the wind shifted, she could hear the distant, rhythmic drumming of the King's Justice Patrol, a deep, heavy sound that felt like her own approaching doom. Chapter 2. The Scars of Justice. King Elias Volkov hated this part of his duty. He stood on the raised stone dais in the Citadel Square, the cold, morning air stinging his cheeks. Below him, the assembled citizens of the lower tiers were a silent, tense sea of gray cloaks. Meanwhile, High Elder Kaelen stood to his right, a snake in silk robes, his satisfied smirk barely concealed, because this spectacle was entirely Kaelen's victory. The law must be applied equally, Elias recited, his voice amplified by his alpha power, booming across the square. He hated the words, they tasted like ash. His blood oath to prioritize stability above all else was a heavy, icy mantle. What's worse, he knew Kaelen had manufactured this treason. The charges were flimsy, the evidence non-existent. Just like that, the prisoner was brought forward, Seraphina Vane. Not Lyra, the sister Kaelen was likely targeting, but the elder Omega. Elias was immediately struck by her stillness. She wore a plain tunic, and her eyes, when they met his, were unnervingly clear. Not with defiance, but with a horrifying acceptance. It was like looking into a still lake that held the reflection of a terrible storm. With every heartbeat, Elias felt the strain of his oath. Seraphina Vane, for the crime of disrespect against the crown, the sentence is a public flogging of 5 strokes, Elias pronounced, his voice granite. Kaelen's lips thinned slightly. The first 4 strokes were administered by the chief enforcer, following Elias's strict, measured command. They were painful, but controlled. Seraphina did not cry out, a testament to her unwavering integrity. She only gripped the post, her knuckles white. But then, Elias felt a surge of cold fury, an unexpected, primal need to stop the ritual. He took the whip from the enforcer. "I will administer the final strike," he announced, his eyes locking onto Kaelen's, daring the elder to challenge him. He would end this quickly. He raised the whip. In the span of a breath, the leather cut the air and descended onto Seraphina's exposed back. The sound was sharp, brutal. And then, everything in Elias's world shattered. A bolt of pure, white heat, pain, ecstasy, and blinding recognition slammed into his chest, centered exactly where the whip had struck her. It was the mate bond. It was a scream of agony of mine that originated in her physical wound and exploded across his alpha soul. The scent that flooded his senses wasn't blood or sweat or fear, it was home. Cinnamon, rain on stone, and something infinitely precious, laced with the unbearable metallic tang of fresh, agonizing hurt. The force was so immense it nearly buckled his knees. He dropped the whip. It landed on the stone with a sickening, wet thwack. Elias stared down at her back, at the wound he had inflicted. It was not just a scar, it was the mark of justice as the mark of mating. His duty, his oath, his very identity had just committed the ultimate betrayal against his own soul. "Enough!" Elias roared, the sound laced with a frantic, protective alpha tone that stunned the entire square into silence. He moved instantly, ripping his own heavy cloak from his shoulders and wrapping it around Seraphina, shielding her from the cold air and the cruel eyes of the crowd. He did not touch her, because the urge to heal her body with his own was an almost uncontrollable, physical demand, and he couldn't afford to expose his sudden weakness. Without thinking, he issued the command that sealed both their fates. "Clear the square. She is to be taken to the Citadel Annex immediately for royal medical care. Not the prison ward." Kaelen's smooth voice sliced through the tension. "Your Majesty, such leniency toward a traitor is unprecedented. It undermines the rule of law." Elias turned, his face a mask of cold, lethal impartiality that hid the screaming alpha beneath. The moment their eyes locked, Kaelen saw not compassion, but threat. "The law requires me to ensure the condemned lives to pay their debt to the crown, Elder. My decision stands," Elias stated. But then, he added, his voice dropping slightly, loaded with a terrifying subtext only Kaelen would understand. "Perhaps you should turn your attention to the true orchestrators of this descent, instead of distracting the crown with minor omegas." Elias watched as Seraphina was gently moved. He could still feel the pulsing agony of the scars through their bond, a constant, painful reminder of his sin and his destiny. As the bond pulsed, he knew he was trapped. He had violated his oath to save his mate, only to place her in the most perilous place possible, the very heart of the treachery that had tried to destroy them both. The air thickened with the smell of whetstone, alpha distress, and the faint, sweet scent of his scarred mate. Chapter 3: The Agony of the Mate Bond. Elias had not slept. Come morning, the sunlight, Usually a welcome golden blade across the citadel's polished floors felt like a judgment. He was in his private study, a room adjacent to the medical annex where Seraphina lay. Meanwhile, the physical space between them was insignificant. The mate bond raged. It felt like his own back was ripped open, burning with every infinitesimal movement she made. The physical pain was secondary to the shame. He poured a cup of cold, bitter tea. As the bond pulsed, the primal voice of his wolf was a constant, low growl demanding two things: heal her, kill the threat. The threat, Elias knew, was Kaelen, but also the law, his duty, and his own devastating choice. A soft knock came at the door. Dr. Lenner entered, pale and jumpy. "The Omega, Your Majesty," Lenner whispered, his eyes flicking nervously toward the annex door. She refuses the heavy narcotics." Elias stiffened. "Refuses? Why?" "She claims they cloud her mind, sire. She asks only for simple salves and water. She exhibits remarkable endurance because she is concerned about clarity of thought." This detail sliced through Elias's guilt. Seraphina Vane was a strategist, not a fainting victim. This strength was a stark contrast to his own emotional paralysis. Elias dismissed the doctor and walked to the annex door. He paused, inhaling deeply. The air inside was heavy with antiseptic and the delicate, earthy scent of his mate, layered over the coppery smell of healing blood. It was intoxicating and terrifying. He entered the room. It was sparsely furnished, dominated by the cot where Seraphina lay, turned onto her side, facing the high window. Her breath caught as she realized he was there. The silence stretched, loud enough to be painful. "Seraphina," Elias finally said, his voice roughened by sleeplessness and the mate bond. She didn't turn. "Your Majesty," she replied, her voice soft, but perfectly steady. No tremble. No subservience. "I have granted your sister full amnesty and provided her with resources outside of the city walls. She is safe," Elias stated, because this was the one good thing he had done, and he needed her to know it instantly. Still, she didn't move. "Thank you, Your Majesty. You fulfilled the promise of the law, and all at once, everything changed for my family." Elias stepped closer, driven by the frantic mate link. The space between them burned. The law was cruel. "I should never have raised my hand against you." "You did your duty," Seraphina countered, the phrase biting the air like frost. "The king cannot allow personal feelings to compromise justice, can he?" Elias winced. "I know what happened at the final moment, Seraphina. I felt it. You felt it. The bond, it is a curse born of a violent, unforgivable act." Before she could move, Elias did the unforgivable. He knelt by the cot. He reached out, his large hand trembling, and gently touched the linen covering her shoulder, just above the raw skin. A fierce, protective purr escaped his throat. As the mark tingled, her body arched slightly toward his touch, an involuntary response from the mate link. The pain in his chest eased immediately, replaced by a surge of overwhelming, warm peace. "We are bound," Elias rasped, looking at the ceiling, unable to meet her gaze. "A king bound to a condemned Omega. Kaelen will use this to tear the kingdom apart." "Then we must not give him the chance to find out." Seraphina finally turned, her eyes dark and intense. Her jaw was set. "I am a strategist, Your Majesty. My mind is clear, and I know the truth. Kaelen didn't want justice. He wanted disruption. My sacrifice was just the spark for his real fire." Elias looked at her, truly seeing the keen intelligence behind the pale Omega facade. With a single glance, he knew his war just found its most unlikely and most crucial ally. "You believe you can help me fight the Elder?" he challenged. "I was his intended victim, but he failed to break me," she stated simply. "I was close to the ground. I know the whispers. You need eyes outside of the nobility, and I can be those eyes." Elias stood, his mind racing. As the truth unraveled, he knew trusting the woman he had just scarred was the only chance he had. He had to trust her capacity for strategy, because his duty demanded he choose the means that guaranteed the kingdom's stability. He just hadn't expected those means to involve radical trust. "Very well, Seraphina Vane. The obsidian chambers will be your prison and your refuge. We begin with the Elder's Whispers. Chapter 4. The First Chess Move. The king's private library was vast, cold, and smelled of old ink and polished fear. Next, Seraphina was installed in a quiet guest wing, but her hours were spent here, in the library, working under the pretense of royal research. Elias had provided the minor, hidden historical text, a dusty, massive tome on the legal history of the High Council. By the time the physician cleared her to sit for longer periods, Seraphina felt the mate bond had become less a scream and more a low, humming frequency, painful, yes, but also clarifying. It allowed her to know Elias's emotional shifts, his deep-seated anxiety, his burning frustration with Kaelen, and his cold, powerful control. Elias entered, his pace quick. He was dressed in high alpha formality, his presence a heavy weight in the room. Kaelen moves today, Elias announced, standing over a table where Seraphina was meticulously organizing notes. He is calling for an emergency session to review the excessive expenditure of resources on a convicted traitor. Meaning you. Seraphina did not look up immediately. She felt it, clear as day, Elias's protective urge fighting his need for public impartiality. That's why she needed to handle this with icy logic. He is testing your conviction, Your Majesty, Seraphina said, her voice dry. She tapped a section of the old text. He wants you to send me away, or better, to the dungeons, because that restores his power, and it makes you look weak and indecisive. He is using the law I swore to uphold, Elias countered, running a hand through his dark hair in frustration. He has the precedent. But what if the law is the tool, not the truth? Seraphina finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes, though still shadowed by pain, held that keen, calculating light. Look at this, Your Majesty. This text is about the treason of the Whispering Elders, for centuries ago. Elias leaned in, his large frame crowding her space. With his scent in the air, the mate bond surged, forcing a shared focus that was intensely, awkwardly intimate. He saw the correlation immediately. He uses the bottom rung of society to leverage the top, Elias breathed, realizing the pattern. My punishment of you, it was merely the opening line of a 4-century-old play. More importantly, Seraphina whispered, her voice conspiratorial. The text mentions that after the whispering treason failed, the leader fled, but his entire personal ledger was seized by the crown and sealed away, because it contained proof of manipulation of royal finances. A ledger, Elias said, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. Proof that Kaelen's ancestors were traitors. Proof that the current elder is merely continuing a legacy of betrayal. Where is it now? It would be hidden in the deepest records, Seraphina mused. Somewhere only the king or the High Elder could access. As if pulled by a string, Kaelen's focus is always on the law. He would never think his weakness lies in his family's history. Elias stepped back, the alpha energy in the room shifting from frustration to dangerous intent. He looked at Seraphina, the scarred Omega, his mate, sitting like a quiet spider in the center of his political web. You are not simply a strategist, Seraphina Vane. You are a weapon, Elias said, admiration softening the edges of his voice. You made me that way, Your Majesty. I learned patience from pain, she replied, her eyes holding his. Between them, something cracked, a barrier of resentment giving way to respect. Then we will fight him with history. But Kaelen is not dull. He is watching us. Before the words left her lips, a sound interrupted them, a discreet, almost inaudible click from the decorative molding near the archway. Elias's head snapped up. Without warning, he moved faster than humanly possible, ripping the ornate wood panel off the wall, revealing a tiny, intricate listening device, a familiar sigil etched on its underside, Kaelen's crest. He is watching us now. Elias growled, crushing the device in his fist. The citadel is not safe. Chapter 5. The Silent Language of the Bound. The citadel had become a gilded cage, and Seraphina, the Omega, the traitor, was its most closely watched prisoner. The air thickened with unspoken words. After they discovered Kaelen's device, all verbal discussion of their mission stopped. Next, their world narrowed to gestures, fleeting glances, and the constant, electric hum of the mate bond, a silent language of necessity. She would sit in the library, ostensibly cataloging texts, while Elias dictated correspondence nearby. But then, when he was troubled, the distant, anxious thrum of his alpha distress would pulse through her scars. As the bond pulsed, Seraphina knew he was thinking of Kaelen's next move. She would discreetly tap the spine of a book, the legal loopholes of 217 AC, to offer him direction. The mate bond was no longer just agonizing, it was an anchor. When Elias was near, the burning of her scars would subside, replaced by a low, rhythmic warmth, because the alpha's presence naturally calmed the mate's pain. This created an addictive, terrifying dependency. Elias came to her wing that evening, bringing a tray of food himself, a deliberate, unusual act that spoke volumes to the few servants still lurking. He did not speak of the mission. "The council will convene in 3 days," Elias said, his voice level, discussing only court business. "My duty demands I present a unified front." Seraphina slowly ate a piece of smoked venison. She met his gaze, and through the bond, she sent a wave of quiet, firm resolve. "Your duty is to the kingdom, not to Kaelen's laws." "You must be perceived as strong, Your Majesty," she said aloud, maintaining the formal address. In the echo of his voice, she felt his pain, the sheer magnitude of the guilt that he was forced to appear impartial while she bore the physical mark of his justice. Elias walked to leave the room. Without another word, he stopped at the doorway, his back to her, and brought his hand up, clenching his fist over his heart, a silent confession of his torment and the oath that still held him. Her chest ached in response. She understood. He was not a monster. He was a man trapped by his word. That's why she had to offer him quiet forgiveness. "The herbs Dr. Lenner provided are effective, Your Majesty." "They promote swift healing," she said simply, referring to the scars. Elias froze. He didn't turn around. As the silence stretched, she felt his profound relief through the bond. Meanwhile, High Elder Kaelen was not idle. A messenger arrived carrying a velvet-lined box. It contained a simple, rough Omega tunic, the exact garment Seraphina had worn during the flogging. No note. Elias stared at it, fury making his muscles taut. It was a direct, chilling message. "I see your weakness. I see your traitor." Before either could speak, which they couldn't, with Kaelen listening, Seraphina reached out, not with her hand, but through the bond, sending Elias a single, sharp mental image, a lock. Elias's eyes, blazing gold with alpha rage, snapped to hers. The mental image shifted, the lock of the High Council archives. Elias knew their plan. He would use the bond to coordinate a covert reconnaissance, a true alpha move that spoke volumes about his strategic trust in the scarred Omega. They would strike first. The tension broke. Elias took the tunic, crushed it in his fist, and burned it in the hearth, leaving only ash. He did not need words. Their war would be fought not on the dais, but in the shadows, fueled by the agonizing, undeniable pulse of their mate bond. Chapter 6. The King's Risk. The air in the deep sublevels of the Citadel archives was cold, smelling of mildewed paper and millennia of buried secrets. That night, Elias moved like a shadow. He wore the darkened leathers of a royal guard, not the velvet of a king, because if he was caught here, Kaelen would have the treason charge he truly wanted. Seraphina was not physically with him. She was back in her guest wing, relying solely on the mate bond, acting as his remote guide. Elias reached the door to the restricted section, a heavy, iron slab etched with the royal seal. He felt a sudden, sharp pain pulse through his scars. Warning. Left. He immediately turned his head. As the wind shifted, down here, it was only a draft of stale air. He smelled it, a faint, acrid scent of a beta-class sedative, subtle but dangerous. Elias didn't hesitate. He took 2 massive steps backward, lunging to the side and flattening himself against the stone wall. Moments later, a thin, silver dart shot across the passage, embedding itself harmlessly in the door. A minor trap. Clever, Kaelen. Elias mentally transmitted a wave of pure, grateful heat towards Seraphina, a powerful, emotional feedback that temporarily eased her chronic pain. He approached the dart, inspecting the wire mechanism. Instead, he followed the wire to a small niche. Hidden inside was a rough-drawn sketch, a caricature of a king kissing a scarred Omega, a final, juvenile threat left by Kaelen's agent. He was furious. This was not just a political threat, it was a personal attack on his mate. The mate bond instantly amplified Elias's protective rage. He felt Seraphina's sympathetic ache for him, her own history of being publicly shamed mirrored in the sketch. Elias used a small, silent pry tool on the ancient iron lock. The air thickened with the smell of friction and metal. He found the lock's tumblers. With every heartbeat, he worked, fueled by her silent presence and urgency. Not only that, but he was aware of the immense risk. He was not just risking his life. He was risking the person he had just realized he couldn't live without. The lock clicked open. Inside, the archive room was smaller, stacked high with dusty scrolls. Elias searched frantically for the seized ledger. He opened a wooden box labeled Treason of the Whispering Elders. It was empty. Kaelen was 2 steps ahead. He knew the king might look for the history. Just like that, Elias's hope plummeted. He transmitted his devastating failure through the bond. Gone. The box is empty. He received a sharp, demanding pulse of Omega insistence. Think, Elias. Kaelen would remove the evidence, but he would leave a breadcrumb to incriminate someone else. Elias forced his alpha mind to slow down. He looked at the box again. It was empty of the ledger, but not of everything. Hidden beneath a false bottom was a small, sealed scroll. It was not Kaelen's family's confession, it was a single signed receipt. The receipt documented the payment for the minor act of treason that Seraphina's sister was initially framed for. And all at once, everything changed. The payment was signed by Elder Malachi, Kaelen's cousin, a known loyalist of the king. Elias snatched the receipt, tucking it inside his leathers. He had exposed a piece of Kaelen's larger network. As the truth unraveled, Elias realized Kaelen was far more powerful and prepared than he initially believed. Elias sprinted back through the silent passages. By the time he reached his study, he knew they had only bought themselves hours, not days. He had the receipt, but Kaelen had the throne's entire political infrastructure locked down. He walked to the annex door, his heart hammering not from exertion, but from the terror of their situation. He had to show Seraphina the receipt and the horrible truth it represented without saying a single word. Their silence was their shield, but it was also their heaviest burden. What followed was the need to plan their most dangerous move yet, a confrontation. Chapter 7. The Unbearable Weight of Impartiality. Elias stared at the receipt signed by Elder Malachi. It was his proof, but it was also a fuse. He knew the elder's cousin would soon be the perfect political shield Kaelen would throw at the king. As the truth unraveled, Elias realized that if he acted too soon, Kaelen would simply execute Malachi and claim the king was manufacturing chaos. That's why they needed Kaelen to overplay his hand first. Seraphina stood nearby, her scarf slightly loose, revealing the still tender scar beneath. The pain in his chest, the constant mate bond echo, was relentless. He transmitted a pulse of weariness to her. "This is consuming me." "Your Majesty, you look exhausted," Seraphina murmured aloud, her voice soft. She was practicing a small, submissive role she devised for the few servants who saw her. Elias walked to the heavy oak table. He did not need words. He placed the Elder Malachi receipt, the evidence of Kaelen's shadow network, under a heavy crystal paperweight. He then placed a second item on top, a small, sealed scroll marked Protocol for Handling State Vulnerabilities. Seraphina received the transmission. The receipt proves Kaelen's network. The protocol scroll tells us what to do next, but it must be done in plain sight. She read the protocol mentally. It detailed an ancient, severe procedure for removing a threat to the throne through a public show of unwavering crown authority. It was a devastatingly cold political tool. In the quiet that followed, Seraphina understood the terrible meaning. Elias had to do something publicly cruel to her to convince Kaelen that the mate bond, the king's weakness, did not exist. "I understand the protocol, Your Majesty," she said, her voice perfectly steady, because her core strength was her tactical patience and integrity. She was ready to accept this next, bitter sacrifice. The council hall. The emergency council session was not held in the private chambers, but in the vast, acoustics-heavy Grand Council Hall, because Kaelen insisted on the maximum audience. High Elder Kaelen rose, his silver robes shimmering under the highlight. "Your Majesty, the persistent and costly presence of the traitor Seraphina Vane in the Citadel's private quarters is a drain on resources and a stain on the Crown's authority." The public whispers. Kaelen's eyes flicked to Elias, searching for any flicker of distress, any sign of the forbidden bond. Seraphina was seated in the public gallery, placed there by Elias's own command, fully exposed. She met Elias's eyes across the massive hall. Her world tilted. The mate bond, usually a strong pulse, felt suddenly muted, encased in ice. And all at once, everything changed. Elias's face, already disciplined, hardened into a mask of pure, unforgiving alpha authority. His scent, usually controlled, flared cold, dominant, and utterly without warmth. He looked at Seraphina, the woman whose pain was his own, and delivered the devastating blow. "High Elder Kaelen, your concern is noted," Elias announced, his voice booming with forced detachment. "The traitor Seraphina Vane has overstayed her usefulness. Her presence has become a vulgar distraction." He paused, letting the silence hang. The pressure from the mate bond was a crushing weight in his skull, the pain of rejection slicing through Seraphina's consciousness like broken glass. Effective immediately, Elias continued, his gaze locked firmly away from the gallery. "I am issuing an official royal repudiation. Seraphina Vane will be stripped of all royal protection and confined to a supervised, minimum security cell in the lower tiers for the remainder of her sentence. She is to be publicly and formally disavowed as any interest or charge of the crown." The gasp rippled through the hall. Kaelen's lips stretched into a look of smug, satisfied triumph. He won. Elias fought the agonizing urge to run to her, to tear the words from the air. He felt her pain, sharp, sudden, and complete, but underneath it, he felt something else, unwavering integrity and tactical patience. She was holding the line. "Seraphina Vane, you are dismissed from my sight," Elias finished, his voice final. Seraphina rose slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, but she executed a perfect, subservient bow to the king. As if summoned, she turned and walked out, her small figure retreating under the weight of the court's stairs. In the span of a breath, the king's facade was successful. Kaelen had what he wanted, a king who had rejected his weakness and upheld the harsh law. That night, Elias locked himself in his study. The pain of the mate bond was a physical wound, but the emotional pain was worse. He had rejected his mate, publicly. He did not need words to understand the severity of his actions. The icy silence from Seraphina's end of the bond was the only response he received. Elias walked to the hearth, firelight casting long, angular shadows. He placed the Elder Malachi receipt and the protocol scroll on the mantel. He had bought time, but at the cost of Seraphina's public shame and the deep, silent trauma of their bond. He had driven his ally away, right into the path of Kaelen's next move. Chapter 8. The Hidden Wire. The minimum security cell was a significant downgrade from the obsidian chambers, but to Seraphina, it was freedom. It smelled of damp straw and stale air, and all at once, everything changed because the walls were thin, forcing her to rely on the king's facade. The pain from Elias's public repudiation was a dull, systemic ache, far worse than the flogging itself. The mate bond was no longer a warm anchor, it was a tight, fraying wire, pulsing only with raw, necessary information. Meanwhile, the king had delivered his final instruction before the repudiation. Seraphina was to use her confinement to track the original route of the framed treason charge. She sat on her cot, meticulously braiding thin strips of straw, a calming ritual. With his scent in the air, a faint, Lingering residual on the meager blanket provided, she felt a sudden, sharp mental image through the bond, the High Council door. Clock icon. Seraphina instantly knew the message. Kaelen is convening the council early. Attack is imminent. Just like that, the separation became a point of no return. Elias was defenseless in the citadel, while she was free to move among the lower tiers without suspicion. That's why she was perfectly positioned to perform the riskiest task. As the wind shifted through the bars, carrying the loud, gossipy murmur of the nearby market, Seraphina felt a new, heavy pulse from Elias, the vote of no confidence. It demands abdication. Seraphina rose. She had to commit fully. She had to gather the evidence Elias could not touch. Because of that, she needed to leave the prison unnoticed. She focused her Omega energy. Her bones remembered him, and she used the mate link to send a silent, desperate question. Escape plan? The answer came back instantly, the forgotten drain. Elias, in his endless study of the Citadel's systems, had pointed out a long-unused drainage tunnel that led from the minimum security facility directly into the restricted, abandoned sewage system beneath the lower tiers. Her breath caught. It was foul, dangerous, and utterly exposed. But then, she realized the beauty of the plan. A convicted traitor was expected to stay put, or to try a simple, predictable breakout. Nobody would suspect an escape through the sewage system, because it was so beneath their dignity. Before she could move, a guard rattled the bars. Omega, stay away from the walls. Seraphina sank back onto the cot, making her face appear pale and frightened. She felt it, clear as day, the immense, protective pride radiating from Elias across the distance. Be safe, little strategist. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the empty air. Her plan was set. She would risk a dangerous, solo mission back into the lower tiers to find the final piece of evidence Kaelen missed, the one thing the Elder could not erase from history. Chapter 9. The Ghost of Betrayal. The air in the sewage tunnel was a thick, suffocating blanket of methane and slime. Next, Seraphina emerged into a forgotten cellar beneath a crumbling, abandoned trade post in the lower tiers, the very neighborhood where her sister had been framed. She was covered in grime, but her eyes held a fierce light. The atmosphere of the lower tiers, once her safe, meticulous world, was now tainted by suspicion. The smells of fermenting waste and stale fear were overwhelming. Despite that, she pressed forward, moving through the labyrinthine back alleys with the tactical patience she'd cultivated her whole life. She didn't know what scared her more, the betrayal of the Alpha King, or the raw, palpable resentment from the populace, who saw her as a traitor who'd been spared the full lash. She reached the small, ruined office of a former clerk who had been instrumental in Kaelen's initial framing of her sister. The building had been burned down months ago, the result of a convenient accident. Seraphina knew the key wasn't a witness, it was paper. Alpha power relies on history and public perception. The key to proving treason lies in the finances, who paid whom, and when. She felt it clear as day, a faint, nervous tremor pulsing from the Elder Malachi receipt Elias had shown her. The nervousness wasn't Elias's, it was the echo of Malachi's fear when he signed the document. Seraphina began to search the rubble, using her heightened Omega senses. With every measured step she took, she sought out any scent that didn't belong to the fire and rot. She moved to the back wall, where the safe had once been. The metal was twisted and black. But then, she noticed something, a small, dark patch of earth, inexplicably loose beneath the corner of the safe's former footprint. Before she could move, a low, guttural growl echoed from the alleyway. A beta guard, attracted by the disturbance, appeared. He was a low-ranking member of Kaelen's private enforcement. Well, look what the sewer dragged in, the beta sneered. The king's used-up whore. I am a citizen, confined to the prison, Seraphina stated, her voice quiet but carrying the force of her integrity. You're on the wrong side of the wall, Omega, the guard scoffed, drawing a short, heavy club. Kaelen said the king isn't watching you anymore. I think I'll take my compensation now. With every heartbeat, Seraphina knew this wasn't about sex, it was about silencing loose ends. She had no alpha strength, no beta claws, only her speed and observation. Her body moved on instinct. As the guard lunged, she didn't fight. She dodged, using the cluttered debris of the ruined office to trip him. She snatched a handful of sharp, brittle charcoal from the ground and hurled it directly into his eyes. The guard screamed, clutching his face. While her pulse raced, Seraphina didn't stop. She dug furiously at the loose earth. Her fingernails tore, but she didn't feel it. She found it, a small, lead-lined cylinder, cool and heavy. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a tightly bound, coded financial ledger, the original, detailed record Kaelen's ancestor had used, updated with Malachi's recent payment. The ledger had been hidden, not by Kaelen, but by the original framing clerk who wanted his own insurance policy. She had the evidence. She had the means to destroy the Elder. She felt it clear as day, a surge of triumph and terror through the bond. Elias knew she had succeeded. But then, the beta guard recovered, his vision blurred but his rage burning. He lunged again, this time with desperate, blind speed. Seraphina gripped the ledger. She had secured the means to save the kingdom, but she still had to survive the escape. The tension broke with a deafening crash as the guard smashed the remnants of the doorway, trapping her inside the burning ruins. Chapter 10: The Ambush and the Fall. Seraphina moved on pure instinct, the coded ledger clutched to her chest. The air thickened with the smell of smoke, blood, and the guard's desperate fury. He lunged, not with skill, but with the reckless weight of a beta determined to claim a reward. Her body moved on instinct, twisting away from the main attack, but the heavy club caught her hard on the temple. She crumpled. The pain was immediate, blinding, and absolute. Her heart skipped a beat, then hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to stay conscious, her fingers tightening around the lead cylinder. But the guard was too fast, too large. He wrestled the cylinder away. Without warning, another figure dropped from the shadows, a tall, heavily cloaked alpha. He was not one of Elias's guard. He moved with cold, professional efficiency, striking the beta guard once, hard, to silence him, because Kaelen didn't want messy confrontations. The alpha looked down at Seraphina. She couldn't see his face, but she smelled the faint, dusty scent of old paper and wealth, a smell common to the nobility, a smell that spoke of the Elder's reach. He took the cylinder. "The king will know," she gasped, tasting coppery blood. The alpha didn't even glance at her. He merely spoke into a wrist-mounted communicator. "The item is secured. Dispose of the collateral." Just like that, he vanished, leaving Seraphina sprawled and bleeding amidst the ruins, the coded ledger gone. She had risked everything. She had been betrayed, not by Elias, but by the relentless reach of the Elder. Isolated, wounded, and with the Elder apparently triumphant, Seraphina felt the familiar, crushing return of her old belief. It was useless. The sacrifice was in vain. "I can only save myself by accepting defeat." The darkness closed in. Meanwhile, in the Citadel Grand Hall, Elias felt the blow instantly. It wasn't the dull ache of the shared scars. It was a physical, debilitating spike of pain, followed by the terrifying sensation of Seraphina's consciousness winking out. The mate bond went silent, leaving a horrifying void. He was standing before the High Council, with High Elder Kaelen presiding. The Elder, seeing the king's momentary, uncontrolled stagger, pressed his advantage. "Your Majesty is unwell," Kaelen announced, his voice carrying feigned concern. "He is showing the unpredictable temperament of one who cannot control his lower instincts or his political attachments." Kaelen then delivered the final, crushing blow. He produced a heavily guarded document, the vote of no confidence. The council, by majority, finds that the king's recent, erratic behavior and the proven existence of a security vulnerability in the Citadel warrants temporary suspension of all Alpha authority, effective immediately. Elias wanted to fight, to rage, to point to the receipt hidden in his study. But the blood oath demanded he obey the law, even a manufactured one, to maintain the kingdom's structural integrity. His world tilted under the weight of his duty and his loss. "I honor the council's decision," Elias stated, his voice devoid of all warmth and power. Until the review is complete, the High Elder assumes all sovereign authority. Elias walked slowly from the hall, a king in name only. But the political defeat paled in comparison to the silence on the mate bond. He transmitted a desperate, silent pulse into the void where Seraphina's presence should be. Seraphina, give me a sign. He received nothing but silence. The ultimate defeat was not losing the throne, it was losing her. Chapter 11. The Darkest Night of the Soul. Elias returned to his study, now feeling dangerously empty. Kaelen's guards were already posted outside the door. He was a prisoner in his own home. He paced, running his hands over the smooth, cold surface of the oak table. He picked up the two items he had risked everything for, the Elder Malachi receipt and the protocol scroll. Useless. Kaelen had the ledger. Maybe it was fate, but his eyes landed on the spot where he had first realized the bond existed, the spot where the flogger had struck. He crumpled the receipt in his hand, a frustrated growl escaping his throat. He had played by the rules, and in return, he had lost his kingdom and possibly his mate. In the ruined trade post, Seraphina lay still, the cold seeping into her bones. The pain in her head was agonizing, but the void where the mate bond should pulse was worse. She was convinced Elias had sacrificed her permanently. She felt it, clear as day, the cold weight of political defeat and her own physical failure. But then, faintly, an echo broke the silence. It wasn't Elias's alpha roar or a demanding pulse. It was a faint, agonizing mental plea. The void was worse for him than for her. As the silence roared, Seraphina realized something crucial. Elias was not abandoning her, he was broken. His silence wasn't rejection, it was the total collapse of his personal defense system. She focused, forcing her blurry eyes open. On the ground, near where the beta had wrestled the cylinder from her, lay a single, thin piece of oilskin. The alpha had taken the ledger, but in his professional haste, he hadn't noticed the external wrapping. The oilskin was empty, but it wasn't useless. She had memorized the first page of the coded ledger before the ambush because her core strength was her tactical patience and observation. Seraphina reached for the oilskin, a desperate, fierce grin touching her lips. The evidence was gone, but she had the key. She had the knowledge. And Elias was still out there, broken but alive. She needed to signal him. But how? She had only the fraying wire of the bond and her tactical mind. She closed her eyes, forcing a mental transmission, a message simple enough to cut through Elias's despair. The oilskin. The protocol. Trust me. Chapter 12. The Leap of Trust. Elias was seated stiffly in his study, the suspension of his alpha authority feeling like a crushing physical weight. As the silence stretched, the despair was a suffocating blanket. But then, it cut through the void, a faint, urgent mental flicker. The oilskin. The protocol. Trust me. Elias jolted upright. Seraphina was alive. Injured, but alive and issuing commands. He looked at the mantelpiece, where the two items lay, the now crumpled Elder Malachi receipt, useless material evidence, and the protocol for handling state vulnerabilities scroll. Elias snatched the protocol scroll. It was an ancient document demanding that any vulnerability threatening the monarchy be resolved through a trial by evidence before the full High Council. Elias knew the plan. Seraphina was the evidence. Her testimony, backed by the coded knowledge she held, would be the only thing strong enough to overcome Kaelen's legal precedents. Elias focused his alpha will, pushing past his residual guilt and pain. He needed to send her an affirmation of absolute trust, a total rejection of his old oath. Elias transmitted a powerful surge of feeling, unconditional acceptance, protective fire, and a single, burning image, a king's crown, offered freely. He stood and walked to the door, ignoring the beta guards Kaelen had posted. Summon High Elder Kaelen to the Grand Hall, Elias commanded, his voice cold, focused, and laced with undeniable alpha authority that defied his suspension. Inform him the king invokes the ancient right of trial by evidence. What followed was the frantic, terrified reaction of Kaelen's guards, who realized their suspended king was about to launch a final, desperate coup. Chapter 13. The Queen's Preparation. Seraphina managed to crawl away from the ruins, seeking refuge in a forgotten beta herbalist's den she knew from her past life. She felt it, clear as day, the immense, staggering surge of unconditional acceptance from Elias. The transmission of the offered crown was a silent promise that broke her lifelong misbelief. She cleaned her head wound with rough herbs, wincing as the sting hit. Despite that throbbing agony, she focused on the task at hand, the knowledge. She had memorized the coded first page of the ledger. It held the formula, the cipher key, used to track centuries of financial manipulation. She used her remaining strength to meticulously burn the oilskin, mixing its ashes with a potent, quick-setting herb paste. The mixture smelled like burnt sugar and betrayal. She carefully applied the paste, packing it into the deep, whip-inflicted scars on her back. Her bones remembered him, and she focused the pain, not on herself, but on the symbol it represented. A low-ranking beta loyal to the king found her, alerted by a signal Elias had hidden in the lower tier's emergency broadcast. The beta gasped at her appearance, scarred, covered in filth, but possessing an utterly focused intensity. The king has invoked the trial by evidence. You must be there, Omega, the beta whispered, terrified. She looked at her torn, bloodied hands. She was a broken vessel, but she held the key to the kingdom. Tell the king, Seraphina instructed, her voice soft but steady. Tell him I will stand. I will present my testimony, but I will present it as the marked traitor. Seraphina rose, her small figure swaying slightly. She was ready to walk into the grand hall. The final confrontation was only moments away. Chapter 14. The Convergence. POV character. King Elias Volkov / setting. The Grand Council Hall. The Grand Council Hall was packed, an arena of political vultures. High Elder Kaelen sat on the king's dais, his face radiating smug confidence. In the stillness that followed, Kaelen struck the floor with the ceremonial staff. King Elias Volkov, Kaelen announced, his voice smooth and condescending. You have been legally suspended. You have no authority to invoke ancient trials. You have no proof, and your only ally is a known traitor. Elias stepped into the hall. He didn't wear his crown. He wore simple, dark alpha leathers. He looked like a man ready for war. His instincts surged, demanding he tear Kaelen from the throne, but he held back, relying on the plan. I invoke my right under the ancient law, Elias stated, his voice resonating with alpha command. The law states that any citizen may present evidence of high treason to the full council if the king's authority is compromised. As the truth unraveled, Kaelen paled slightly. The elder had focused so much on stripping Elias's authority that he forgot the ancient protocols that bypassed the council entirely. And who, may I ask, is this citizen? Kaelen sneered, attempting to regain control. Your secret, Omega lover? Elias looked directly at Kaelen, his golden eyes blazing with lethal calm. As the bond pulsed, he felt Seraphina's proximity. She was here. The witness is the one whose body bears the price of your initial deception, Elder, Elias said, his voice dangerously soft. But then, the side doors to the hall opened, and silence fell like a physical force. Seraphina Vane walked in. She was no longer pale. Her cheeks were flushed with fever and determination. Her clothes were rough, still bearing the stains of the sewer, and the salve on her back was visible beneath the loose fabric, emphasizing the angry, red pattern of the healing scars. She walked the long distance to the center of the hall, her posture not that of an Omega, but a queen marching to war. She did not look at Kaelen. She walked straight toward Elias. When her name left his lips, Seraphina, it was a prayer, a confession, and a promise, all at once. Kaelen roared, scrambling to his feet. Stop. She is a felon. She cannot testify. He stepped forward, placing himself between Kaelen and his mate, making the final, public commitment. The law I swore to uphold, Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying growl directed at Kaelen, demands she speak. We will hear her evidence now. and the kingdom will bear witness to the full, scarred truth. Chapter 15. The Trial by Scars. High Elder Kaelen was a pillar of fury. Silence. The king is suspended. I rule this council. Elias ignored him. He stepped closer to Seraphina, his proximity a silent, potent shield. He didn't touch her, but the mate bond flared, strong and warm, filling the space between them. I am Seraphina Vane, Omega citizen and convicted traitor, she stated, her voice clear, amplified by the immense will of the Alpha beside her. I bear the mark of the king's justice, and with it, the truth of High Elder Kaelen's treason. Kaelen roared, but the king's quiet authority held the room. You speak of a coded ledger, one that Kaelen's agent seized, Seraphina continued, raising her voice. That ledger contained the cipher, the key to tracking centuries of financial sabotage by the Elders' family, starting with the treason of the Whispering Elders. The original document is gone. But then I have the cipher here. She carefully brushed the loose fabric away from her back. The sight of the angry, healing whip marks, the scars of her sacrifice, was shocking. But pressed into the deep, whip-inflicted wounds was the dark, sticky herbal paste she had created using the ashes of the oilskin and her salves. The cipher key is the formula I placed into these scars, she declared, the sheer audacity stunning the council into silence. It is a mixture only an Omega herbalist would know, visible only because of the mark of justice that binds me to the king. She began to recite the complex, coded formula, a chain of dates, names, and concealed financial transactions that linked Kaelen directly to the current state of financial instability and the original framing of her sister. With every heartbeat, the complex string of numbers and words exposed Kaelen's systematic corruption. As the truth unraveled, Kaelen, for the first time, looked terrified. He knew that cipher was real. Lies. She is a liar. She is the king's feverish, delirious mistress. Kaelen shrieked, breaking court decorum. Elias stepped forward, his full alpha presence crushing the air around Kaelen. I admit to this council, and before the laws of our land, Elias announced, his voice powerful and final. Seraphina Vane is my fated mate. The scars she bears are the scars of my duty, and the pain is mine. I violated my oath to protect her, but I uphold my vow to this kingdom. She speaks the truth because her integrity surpasses any law, and I vouch for the truth of her testimony. The council erupted. But the weight of the king's confession, combined with Seraphina's verifiable, coded data, broke Kaelen's control. Just like that, several betas and minor nobles, Kaelen's former loyalists, rose and confirmed portions of Seraphina's testimony. Kaelen's meticulously built power structure crumbled instantly. The elder screamed, launching himself at Seraphina. Before she could move, Elias intercepted the attack with brutal, precise force. Kaelen was subdued and dragged away, his fate sealed by ancient law. Chapter 16. Healing and New Equilibrium. The Grand Council Hall fell into stunned silence. In the quiet that followed, the council voted overwhelmingly to restore Elias's full authority and, crucially, to recognize Seraphina's role in exposing the high treason. Elias turned, his intense gaze falling upon Seraphina. She was swaying, the adrenaline gone, the fever from her wound setting in. He did not need words. He walked to her, disregarding the custom that forbade touching a public figure in the hall. He gently lifted her into his arms. As if pulled by a string, her small body relaxed against his powerful frame. The mate bond, no longer strained, flowed between them a torrent of mutual relief, pain, and overwhelming love. You risked everything, my queen, Elias murmured into her hair, his scent washing over her cinnamon, stone, and absolute devotion. You trusted me, she whispered, her hands weakly clutching his tunic. You chose me over the oath. I chose the true duty, Elias corrected, because his oath's true purpose was stability, and she was the only stability he had ever known. Elias carried her back to the obsidian chambers. That night, the council formally stripped Kaelen of all titles and sentenced him to permanent exile for high treason. Elias issued a decree acknowledging the unjust punishment Seraphina had received and her subsequent loyalty, which meant her scars were no longer marks of shame, but symbols of resilience. Seraphina recovered slowly. 1 week later, Elias placed his ancestral alpha crown on her head in a quiet, private ceremony. She was not just queen by bond, but queen by action. Elias ruled with a newfound balance. He enforced the law with impartiality, but now tempered with the compassion Seraphina had taught him. The first new law they drafted reformed the Elder Council, ensuring justice was tempered with mercy, the embodiment of their central theme, the difference between justice and duty. 6 months later, Seraphina and Elias stood on the highest citadel balcony, overlooking the vast lower tiers, now bustling and peaceful. The cold wind whipped her hair, but she was warm, tucked securely against Elias's side. Elias gently traced the smooth, silvery skin where the scars had healed, leaving only pale, star-like marks. As the mark tingled, she felt pure, untainted warmth, no pain, no guilt. "They are beautiful," Elias whispered, his large hand reverently covering the spot. "They are my beginning, not my end," Seraphina replied. She tilted her head, pressing a soft kiss to the place on his neck where his alpha mark pulsed. Her soul answered his silent vow. "You taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to trust the person who caused you the most pain," Elias murmured. "Healing through radical trust." Seraphina smiled, looking out at the kingdom they had saved together. "And you taught me that the king's true duty is not to the letter of the law, but to the truth in his heart." As if fate demanded it, a low, satisfying alpha purr rumbled in Elias's chest, enveloping them both in the silent promise of stability and love. Their painful beginning had forged an unbreakable future. The end. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for more Werewolf Shifters romance stories, and also don't forget to hit the like button.